Imagine being about to board a flight that promised to change your life, but seconds before takeoff, a mysterious voice commands, "Get out now." Would you obey, even without understanding why? This is the true story of someone who chose to listen to the inexplicable and live to tell the tale. What seemed like paranoia turned into the most unbelievable deliverance you've ever heard. Get ready. Every detail will send chills down your spine. The day had been marked on the calendar for weeks. For Edward, it wasn't just an ordinary trip. It was the kind of journey that carried expectations, dreams, and even a certain weight of destiny. Each step toward the airport meant more than miles traveled. It represented the chance for a real change in life. Some travel for love, others for work, and some for the hope of a fresh start. For him, that ticket meant exactly that, a turning point. It was the kind of opportunity that doesn't come twice, and the mere thought of missing it already made his heart race. From early on, everything seemed to fall into place like an inevitable choreography. Edward's suitcase was carefully packed, documents neatly arranged on the table, the alarm set to ensure no mistakes. Details that reveal how, for us, life is always planned as if nothing could slip out of control. The curious thing is that it's precisely when everything seems in order that the unexpected finds room to manifest. And that morning, the feeling that something bigger was brewing already lingered in the air. The airport, a symbol of departures and arrivals, held silent stories in every corridor. Anyone who's been in one knows there are always tight hugs, quick farewells, hidden tears, and even anxious smiles from those who couldn't sleep properly, imagining the reunion. It was in this setting that Edward found himself, carrying not just a suitcase, but also an invisible weight. The hope that upon returning from that flight, life would never be the same. For many, flying is routine. For others, a rare privilege. Studies show that in England, thousands of people still see an airplane as a symbol of achievement, and when they board for the first time, the memory stays etched forever. The sensation of takeoff, the roar of the engines, the tightening in the chest when the wheels leave the ground, all blend into an unforgettable moment. Now imagine that, beyond the usual anticipation, Edward carried an intimate conviction that this flight held something special, something that couldn't be explained with simple words. As he walked toward the gate, thoughts swirled. Maybe it was just another business trip, maybe just a reunion with Catherine, the sister he hadn't seen in years. But with every step, there was a certainty that destiny was already writing lines he couldn't yet read. And that perception, though silent, planted an uncomfortable doubt. Why this feeling that this flight wasn't just another one? It was impossible to predict, yet, as in every good story, the signs were there from the start, small, almost imperceptible. The audience didn't know yet, but that simple boarding held a secret capable of turning an ordinary man like Edward into a witness of something that would forever change his view of life. And the question remains, if it were you in his place, would you have boarded without looking back? Here at Are There Angels Among Us? Every video is more than a story. It's an experience that moves, transforms, and stays with you. Subscribe now and turn on notifications to live every twist of fate with us. The day had started with a subtle strangeness. Edward's alarm, set to go off at 6 sharp, didn't ring. A small detail, but enough to throw off the entire sequence of that morning. The digital clock blinked, as if there had been a power outage overnight, though no light in the house had gone out. Waking up late for an important trip was, in itself, the first hint that something unusual was beginning to unfold. Coincidence, perhaps, but Edward's heart already sensed there was more behind that small setback. Terrified at the thought of missing the flight, he dressed hurriedly, grabbed his suitcase, and ordered a taxi through the app. The driver, however, took ages to accept the ride. When a car finally became available, the wait felt endless. Edward's sweaty hands gripped the phone as if he could speed up time. As he stared out the window, he recalled stories told by acquaintances. When the path insists on delaying you, it might be a warning. With every passing minute, the feeling grew that invisible forces were interfering with his journey. When the car arrived, an even bigger setback, unusual traffic at that hour of the morning. Unexpected roadwork blocked part of the main route, forcing the driver to take a long detour. Horns blared and anxiety mounted. Curiously, Edward noticed that the clock didn't just seem to tick, it mocked him. It was as if every second lost was part of something bigger trying to prevent him from reaching the airport. The discomfort grew, not just from the delay, but from the strange conviction that all these setbacks had a hidden purpose. In the midst of the rush, the worst nearly happened. When he opened his backpack to check his ticket, Edward realized he had forgotten his wallet on the table at home. His blood ran cold for a moment. Without documents, he couldn't board. He asked the driver to turn back and retrieve it. That unexpected stop cost him even more time. Yet when he grabbed the wallet, he noticed an old note tucked inside, written years ago by his mother. "Sometimes, God delays the path to save a life." The detail sent shivers down his spine. Was it just a coincidence to stumble upon that piece of paper that very morning? Back in the taxi, the ride remained slow, marked by every second of impatience. Edward wasn't a superstitious man, but he began to wonder, why so many setbacks in a row? Psychologists say that when intuition insists on calling, the body responds before reason. Cold sweat, racing heart, that knot in the stomach that's hard to ignore. And on that journey to the airport, every sign felt like an invisible push, forcing him to question whether he should really board. The car finally approached the airport, but Edward no longer carried just luggage. He carried an unease he couldn't name. Were these just ordinary delays of a chaotic morning, or was fate trying to scream before it was too late? That was the question echoing in his mind, and the doubt would only grow in the minutes to come. And have you ever lived a day where everything seemed to go wrong without explanation? Here at Are There Angels Among Us? Every detail might be a warning. Write in the comments, "I've been through this," if you believe delays can be signs, or just coincidence if you think they're merely chance. As soon as the taxi stopped at the airport entrance, Edward felt the weight of urgency fall on his shoulders. The main entrance was packed, suitcases dragging across the floor, voices overlapping in different languages, children crying from exhaustion and anxiety. The distinctive smell of fresh coffee mixed with the metallic scent of air conditioning created a unique atmosphere, as if the place were a parallel world where time and emotion blurred. Amid the chaos, one thing was certain: every second counted, and every glance at the clock made his heart race even faster. The lines snaked like slow rivers, defying the urgency of those racing against time. Staff asked for calm, passengers argued about carry-ons, and loudspeakers repeated announcements that seemed to echo endlessly. The mechanical voice listed delayed flights, changed gates, missed connections. Among those words, Edward tried to find his flight number, like someone searching for a sign of relief in the chaos. But with every announcement, the feeling grew that fate was toying with him. And worse, there was no room to back out. His body moved quickly, but his mind seemed to crawl in slow motion. Documents checked, luggage dropped off, metal detector beeping for no apparent reason. Every detail reminded him that, even in highly controlled environments, the unexpected always finds a way. Curiously, psychological studies show that airports are among the places where anxiety spikes are most common. The mix of haste, fear of flying, and the sense of being trapped in a larger system creates invisible tension. For Edward, that tension was beginning to seep into every gesture. Inside the boarding lounge, the faces around him reflected different emotions. Some smiled while talking on the phone, others tried to hide discreet tears, and some stared blankly into space, lost in secret thoughts. The air carried a mix of expensive perfume and nervous sweat, a reminder that everyone there shared more than physical space. They shared the same uncertainty about what awaited them in the sky. Edward took a deep breath, trying to convince himself everything was under control, but something inside still whispered that this day wouldn't be like the others. When the gate opened, the crowd stood up at once, as if obeying an invisible command. The sound of suitcase wheels clattering against the floor echoed in unison, like an army marching. Edward followed the flow, handing over his ticket, hearing the usual "have a nice trip" from the flight attendant with her automatic smile. Every gesture seemed normal, but hid a growing sense that routine masked something bigger. After all, danger doesn't always reveal itself immediately. Sometimes it hides behind apparent normalcy. Stepping into the plane was like crossing a silent threshold. The narrow aisle, the sound of seatbelts clicking, the clatter of luggage being stowed overhead. The environment smelled of new fabric mixed with disinfectant, an aroma unique to airplanes. Passengers adjusted pillows, tested entertainment screens, while the captain's voice announced calmly, "Ladies and gentlemen, prepare for takeoff." Edward breathed deeply, trying to convince himself that everything would now follow its normal course. But the question lingered. To what extent was that normalcy just an illusion about to shatter? At the airport, every delay, every announcement over the loudspeaker seems to carry more weight than usual. Here at Air There, Angels Among Us, every detail can be a sign. And you? Have you ever felt that something seemingly ordinary hid a bigger warning? Write in the comments, "I felt it," if you believe in signs, or "I don't believe" if you think it's just chance. The leather seat felt comfortable at first, but within minutes, a sense of unease began to invade every part of Edward's body. The air conditioning blew cold, yet beads of sweat trickled down his neck. His heart pounded hard, racing, as if in a race with no finish line. Around him, everything seemed normal. Passengers flipping through magazines, flight attendants smiling naturally, children vying for a spot by the window, but inside something screamed that it wasn't right to stay there. The first signs were almost imperceptible: a tightness in the stomach, a lump in the throat, the short breaths that insisted on speeding up for no apparent reason. Psychologists call this a physiological response to danger, even when the brain doesn't identify a visible threat. The body, however, recognizes something the mind hasn't yet processed. And in that cabin, surrounded by strangers, Edward felt every muscle tense as if an invisible shadow were pushing him out. As he observed the passengers, he noticed how normalcy contrasted with his inner turmoil. A couple whispered excitedly about their vacation. An elderly woman closed her eyes in silent prayer. A young man slipped on headphones and nodded to some music. Everything followed its natural course, and that very normalcy heightened his anguish. Why was he the only one on edge? His mind tried to convince him it was just flight anxiety, but his heart insisted something bigger was at play. With every minute, the feeling grew like a wave that wouldn't recede. Sweat now dampened his palms, his feet tapped nervously on the floor, his eyes scanned every detail of the environment for an escape. Even the normal sounds of the plane, the hum of the engines being tested, the seatbelt announcement, the metallic creak of the doors, sounded louder, almost deafening. It was as if everything around him conspired to amplify his unease. Research suggests the human body has a kind of internal radar called somatic intuition, capable of detecting invisible patterns before the rational mind understands them. Perhaps that's what was happening to Edward. Perhaps it was just irrational fear, but with every racing heartbeat, the conviction grew that something terrible was approaching. The problem was, inside a plane about to take off, there's no room to simply stand up and leave unnoticed. The inner silence became deafening. Instinct said, "Don't stay here." Reason countered, "Everything's fine, don't be ridiculous." This internal battle turned every second into an eternity, and the big question remained: how long could he endure that pressure without breaking down in despair? The silence in the cabin was broken not by the captain's announcement or the safety briefing, but by something far deeper. A firm, calm, and utterly undeniable voice echoed in Edward's mind. It didn't come from the loudspeakers or blend with the murmurs of passengers around him. It was a direct, almost cutting command. "Get out now. Do not board this plane." His entire body froze as if time had stopped, and for a few seconds, his breath was lost. He looked around for any reaction. No passenger seemed to notice anything. The couple kept laughing softly. The elderly woman continued her silent prayer. The young man still had his headphones on. Everything remained the same, as if nothing had happened. And that contrast made the mystery even greater. Why did it seem only he had heard it? His mind scrambled for a logical explanation, but the supernatural calm of that voice didn't feel like his own thoughts. It was as if someone invisible had spoken directly to his soul. The minutes that followed were suffocating. His heart raced, his throat dried, and his mind filled with questions that found no answers. Was he going mad? Was it just an anxiety attack? Experts say that in extreme situations, the human brain can create auditory hallucinations as a defense mechanism. But there was something different here. The voice carried no confusion or fear, only a serene authority, almost protective. It felt impossible not to obey. The doubt now wasn't whether he had heard it, but whether he'd have the courage to heed the call. Edward closed his eyes for a moment, trying to ignore it. Yet the command repeated itself with the same firmness. "Get out now. Do not board this plane." The sensation was so vivid that the hairs on his arms stood on end. It was as if every cell in his body reacted to the command, as if his entire being recognized a truth his mind still resisted. The challenge wasn't believing he had heard it. It was deciding whether to obey or ignore it in front of dozens of strangers. Similar stories have been reported throughout history, people who cancelled trips, missed appointments, or changed paths at the last minute after a gut feeling or an inner voice, and later discovered they had escaped tragedy. Some call it coincidence, others divine intervention, but when you live it yourself, the doubt stops being theoretical. And now, sitting in that seat, Edward faced a choice that could cost everything. The tension was unbearable. The voice didn't shout or insist aggressively. It simply commanded with a calm so powerful it was impossible to ignore. And with each repetition, the sense of urgency grew. The plane hadn't yet closed its doors. There was still time to leave. But what would the other passengers say? What would the crew think? How could he justify such an inexplicable fear? That was the internal battle turning into a storm. And the big question remained, would he have the courage to stand up before it was too late? And you, if a mysterious voice told you to get off a plane about to take off, what would you do? Here at Air, there are angels among us. Every decision can change everything. Write in the comments, I'd get out, if you'd obey without a second thought, or I'd stay if you'd try to ignore it. His body remained still in the seat, but Edward's mind waged a fierce battle. Logic screamed, it's just your imagination. This is all nerves. If you get up now, you'll lose the ticket, waste money, and be a laughingstock. The reasoning seemed solid, but it wasn't enough to silence what was happening in his heart. It was as if two opposing forces clashed within him, reason trying to keep him seated, and something invisible insisting that leaving was the only right choice. His hands trembled slightly as thoughts collided. He'd read in magazines about panic attacks on planes, about passengers who backed out at the last minute and regretted it later. Maybe that's all this was. But why had that voice sounded so clear, so distinct, so impossible to mistake for a random thought? The weight of that doubt turned the simple act of staying seated into silent torture. His eyes scanned the cabin for external signs. No one seemed to share his unease. A child laughed loudly, a man flipped through a newspaper, a young woman adjusted her headphones. Everything seemed perfectly normal, but inside Edward, normalcy had vanished. His chest heaved irregularly, cold sweat dripped down his forehead, and the sense of urgency didn't fade. It grew with every second like an internal alarm that couldn't be silenced. Practical thoughts mixed with emotion. How much money would he lose if he gave up? What explanation would he give Catherine, waiting for him at the destination? How could he justify such a sudden exit in front of dozens of strangers? Psychologists call this cognitive conflict. The rational mind builds barriers while intuition tries to break through. And in that invisible clash, the heart always beats harder, as if trying to warn that life isn't just about numbers and justifications. The moment felt endless. Part of him said staying was the right move, that it was just irrational fear. Another part, deeper and quieter, insisted that leaving now would avoid something terrible. It was an internal war with no clear victor, but with consequences that could define everything. And with every racing heartbeat, the certainty that time was running out became unbearable. The plane hadn't taken off yet. The doors were about to close, the aisle still clear for anyone who wanted to leave, but the window of opportunity was shrinking by the second. The dilemma was simple yet devastating. Stay and risk his life, or leave and carry the mark of ridicule in front of everyone. That was Edward's crossroads, and the answer had to come now. The final moment seemed to have arrived. The plane's door was about to close when an uncontrollable impulse overtook Edward. His body acted before his mind could stop it. He stood up abruptly, nearly tripping in the narrow aisle, drawing every eye in the cabin. His heart pounded so loudly, it seemed to drown out the engines already roaring in preparation for takeoff. In that second, every gaze turned against him, as if he'd broken an unspoken rule of cabin silence. He rushed toward the flight attendant, who raised her eyebrows in surprise. "I need to get out, now," he said with a trembling voice, but filled with urgency. The attendant hesitated, glancing at her watch and then at the supervisor. Passengers began to murmur, some chuckling quietly, others shaking their heads in disapproval. To onlookers, the scene seemed like the irrational whim of a nervous passenger. But for Edward, it was a matter of life or death. The silence was broken by sharp comments from the seats. "Another scaredy cat," someone whispered mockingly. "Superstitious, obviously," another added, sparking giggles from those watching. The weight of collective judgment crashed over him like an avalanche. No one understood what was happening in Edward's chest. To them, he was just a man too weak to face the flight, Yet with every passing second, his conviction that he needed to leave only grew. The flight attendant finally nodded, communicating with the captain. The door was reopened, a rare and frowned-upon action in aviation. Edward grabbed his carry-on in a hurry, feeling his back burn under the disapproving stares. He descended the stairs with shaky legs, as if he'd just committed the greatest folly of his life. The relief of being out mixed with shame, the sense of becoming the spectacle of dozens of strangers. The paradox was cruel, humiliated in front of everyone, yet strangely safe. As he walked down the corridor back to the terminal, the sound of the doors closing behind him echoed like a verdict. Inside, the laughter, whispers, and stares would never be forgotten. But at the same time, something inside whispered that this decision, however painful in that moment, was the only one capable of saving him. Curiously, aviation history has recorded dozens of similar cases. Passengers who backed out of flights at the last minute and later discovered that inexplicable act had been their deliverance. Edward sat on a bench in the terminal, panting, feeling a mix of anger, shame, and confusion. He wondered if he'd just thrown away a great opportunity or escaped something far greater than he could imagine. It was impossible to know in that moment. The only certainty was that he had obeyed that mysterious voice, and now he had to face the consequences of what everyone judged as cowardice. But the question lingered: was it truly cowardice, or the most courageous act of his life? The cold terminal bench felt even harder than it was. Edward slumped onto it, his body heavy and his mind in turmoil. With every sidelong glance from other passengers passing through the hall, the shame grew. He was certain the whispers still echoed. Coward, superstitious, overreacting. The flush on his face was unavoidable, and he wished he could vanish into the hurried crowd. His pride told him he'd made the biggest mistake of his life. Outside, through the airport's large windows, he could see the plane slowly taxiing down the runway. His heart sank as he realized that was the flight meant to take him to Catherine. Every movement of the aircraft seemed to mock the decision he'd just made. Tears threatened to fall, but he held them back with effort. Thinking about the money lost, the postponed commitments, and the disappointment he'd cause felt like carrying an invisible weight, impossible to shed. The doubt hammered. What if it was all just his imagination? The airports. Noise didn't help. Constant boarding announcements, lively chatter, suitcases being dragged in a hurry. Life went on as normal for everyone but him. The contrast between his own silence and the general bustle made everything feel even more absurd. Psychologists say that when we make a decision outside social norms, regret often hits quickly, like a cruel mental mechanism punishing us. And Edward was living every second of that mental torture. The worst was imagining his sister's face at the destination, eagerly awaiting his arrival. How could he explain his absence? What justification could he give for such a bizarre act? There was no reasonable answer. The most he could say was, "I heard a voice. I couldn't stay." But who would believe that? The thought tightened his chest even more. If he already felt foolish, he now seemed doomed to be labeled insane. With every passing minute, the regret grew, suffocating like a heavy cloud. And yet, deep down, a spark still burned. Something told him that this decision, however senseless it seemed, would make sense. That intuition was almost imperceptible amid the shame, but it didn't vanish. It was like a spark hidden in the darkness of doubt. And even without proof, it kept Edward restless. If he had truly made the biggest mistake of his life, why did that voice still sound so clear in his mind? Outside, the plane positioned itself for takeoff. Edward discreetly wiped his eyes, trying to regain his dignity. He might never know if his choice was right, but deep inside, something was preparing him for a revelation that would change everything. What seemed like mere failure would soon reveal a purpose far greater than he could imagine. And you? Have you ever made a decision that made you look foolish in front of everyone, but deep down felt like it had a greater purpose? Here at Air There Angels Among Us, every detail might hide a deliverance. Comment below, "I've been through this," if you've experienced something like this, or not yet, if you haven't felt anything similar. The minutes that followed were pure anguish. Sitting on the hard terminal bench, Edward watched through the window as the plane taxied slowly down the runway. His mind still fought against the decision, searching for arguments to avoid feeling like a failure. The inner silence was almost unbearable, and his heart beat in an irregular rhythm. Then, the unthinkable happened. A deafening roar shook the air, so powerful it rattled the airport's glass walls. The sound echoed like metallic thunder, but there were no clouds in the sky. Passengers stopped abruptly. Suitcases fell to the floor. Children began to cry. Instinct drove everyone to rush to the large windows, seeking an explanation. And what they saw on the horizon, no one would ever forget. A column of black smoke rose rapidly, illuminated by flames painting the sky. The plane, the same one Edward should have been on minutes earlier, had exploded in midair. Metal. Fragments fell like pieces of a shattered star. The initial silence of shock quickly turned into screams, despair, frantic phone calls. The impossible had happened before dozens of witnesses. Edward's body froze. His legs simply wouldn't respond. Only his hands trembled, and his breath faltered as if the air had run out. The sight before his eyes was the materialization of the command he'd heard minutes earlier. Get out now. A mix of terror and gratitude washed over him as tears finally escaped, unstoppable. What had seemed like cowardice now revealed itself as the greatest deliverance of his life. Curiously, aviation history records similar incidents. Passengers who backed out of flights due to intuition or inexplicable delays and later discovered they'd escaped death. Some experts call it statistical coincidence. Others see it as something science can't yet explain. For those who lived it, though, there's no doubt. It's impossible to witness such an accident and not believe a greater force intervened. Chaos engulfed the terminal. People tried to hug family members who weren't on the flight, while others collapsed, knowing a loved one was aboard. The scene was one of collective pain, but for Edward there was also a cruel reality. Every scream, every tear reminded him he was supposed to be on that plane. The empty seat he left behind now burned in his memory as a living testament to something impossible that had happened. As he watched the smoke spread across the horizon, one question echoed in his mind. Why me? There was no immediate answer, only the certainty that a mysterious command had pulled him out seconds before the tragedy. And now, with a shattered yet grateful heart, Edward understood he could never look at life the same way again. The deliverance had come, but with it, the weight of a mystery that would follow him forever. The collective scream echoed through the terminal, but for Edward, everything seemed muffled, as if the sound had been swallowed by an absolute void. His heart, once racing, now beat too slowly, too heavily, as if carrying the weight of all the lives just lost. No amount of tears could express what was happening inside him. Only the cold, direct thought, I was supposed to be there. That was my seat. The scene before his eyes didn't match the reality his mind still tried to hold on to. Passengers hugged strangers. Staff tried to organize the crowd. Some knelt on the floor in tears. But Edward couldn't move. It was as if he were trapped in a glass cocoon, seeing everything, hearing everything, but unable to react. The question pounded. Why was I spared? What pulled me out seconds before the tragedy? That doubt didn't just cut through his chest. It tore through every fiber of his soul. His body reacted strangely. His hands trembled uncontrollably. His mouth was dry as if he'd crossed a desert, and his gaze remained fixed on the smoky horizon. Studies show that in traumatic situations, the mind enters a state of dissociation. The person remains physically present, but feels like a mere spectator of themselves. Edward was living exactly that. The reality felt distant, while his mind repeated the same phrase relentlessly. I should be dead. The memory of the empty seat haunted him. He could clearly picture the number printed on his boarding pass, the space he left behind. Now, that piece of burned fabric was a symbol of what could have been the end of his story. The contrast was unbearable. Dozens of lives ended in an instant, while he remained there breathing, unable to understand why. That contrast crushed him, as if every breath was a reminder of an invisible debt. As the minutes passed, the commotion grew. Phones rang non-stop. News outlets already called it a national tragedy, and desperate families arrived searching for names. Edward watched it all, unable to utter a single word. It was as if he'd lost his voice along with the victims. Amid the chaos, the only thing that remained clear was the mystery of his survival, and the inner silence, more than any scream, was what truly cut through his chest. Deep down, one truth imposed itself. He could never be the same after this. He would live every day with the memory of that moment, carrying a question that might never be answered. Fate had spared him, but with that deliverance came the weight of understanding that life is guaranteed to no one. The shock was still paralyzing, but it was already transforming into something greater, the need to discover the purpose behind that day. If you were in Edward's place, sitting in the terminal and realizing you should have been among the victims, how would you handle that feeling? Here at Are There Angels Among Us, every spared life carries a purpose. Write in the comments, I wouldn't understand if you'd be in shock, or I'd seek answers if you'd try to understand why. The days following the tragedy were a whirlwind of news, tears, and unanswered questions. Newspapers splashed headlines about the accident, TV channels replayed images of the smoke on the horizon, and radios broadcast emotional witness accounts. The entire country followed, trying to understand how a routine flight had turned into a catastrophe. Amid reporters and cameras, Edward's name began to surface, the passenger who backed out at the last minute. Public curiosity quickly turned into pressure. Journalists surrounded him at the airport, tried interviews outside the hotel, insisted on calling his family. They wanted to know why he'd gotten off, what he felt if he'd had a premonition, but Edward couldn't speak, not because he lacked words, but because none seemed enough to describe that mysterious voice. Saying he'd heard something no one else did would sound like delirium, so he chose silence. The contrast was cruel. On one side, families mourned at collective funerals, clutching photos and memories. On the other, he walked alive through the streets, carrying an invisible weight no one could see. Every suspicious glance seemed to ask, why were you spared and mine wasn't? Guilt mixed with gratitude, creating an emotional prison hard to bear. Psychologists call this survivor's guilt, a common scar for those who escape tragedies while others don't get the same chance. Alone in his room, Edward relived the scene repeatedly. The empty seat, the firm voice, the desperate decision. The question wouldn't leave his mind. Who spoke to me in that moment? Was it just my imagination, or was it something greater beyond human understanding? The doubt was constant, and each replay only deepened the mystery. There was a sense of purpose, but also an unbearable void from not understanding what that purpose was. Curiously, while researching quietly, he found similar stories in obscure internet forums and forgotten books on library shelves. People who heard a voice, followed a strange intuition, and escaped fatal accidents. They weren't isolated cases, but they all shared one thing. No one could explain it clearly, and they were almost always dismissed. This deepened his dilemma. Sharing his story meant facing ridicule, but staying silent meant carrying a secret alone that could change others' lives. In that moment, Edward realized the search for answers wouldn't just be external. It wasn't about waiting for journalists or investigators to uncover what happened. It was an intimate, silent journey that began within his own heart, a path that would require courage to face the truth, even if that truth had no visible proof. And that journey was just beginning. The weight of silence no longer fit inside him. After days trying to swallow the memory of the voice that echoed in the cabin, Edward understood he needed to speak. He chose a simple, intimate setting, his living room, with close family gathered. His hands trembled slightly as he took a deep breath. His face showed the mix of pain and relief of someone about to reveal a secret that could change everything. The silence in the room was broken only by his heavy breathing before the first words. The story began slowly. He spoke of the anxiety that morning, the inexplicable delays, the growing anguish as he sat on the plane. Everyone listened intently, some holding back tears, others furrowing their brows in skepticism. Then Edward described the moment the voice spoke with absolute clarity. "Get out now. Do not board this plane." The words echoed through the room as if still alive, piercing everyone hearing them for the first time. The impact was immediate. Some sat in stunned silence, eyes wide, unsure how to react. Others leaned forward, eager for details. Was it like it was in your head? Was it a man's or a woman's voice? Some laughed nervously, unable to accept the idea of something so supernatural. But one thing was certain. No one could ignore the impossible coincidence that the mysterious command aligned exactly with the plane's explosion. Amid the reactions, Edward noticed something curious. Even those who scoffed couldn't hide the goosebumps on their arms, as if the story touched a deep, inexplicable place. It's like hearing accounts of survivors who felt an invisible push to change course. You can doubt with your mind, but the body responds with signs that it's bigger than it seems. In that moment, the room was divided between skepticism and reverence. In the days that followed, the story spread among friends, neighbors, and even in a faith community. In a small church, Edward shared his experience before people who were deeply moved. Some cried, others raised their hands in prayer. His message wasn't about self-promotion, but a warning. There are things we can't explain, but they can save our lives. The testimony left a mark on everyone present, as if each had been part of that story without ever being there. Curiously, whether they believed or not, everyone who heard it began to think differently before boarding a plane, ignoring a strong intuition or dismissing an inexplicable shiver. Edward's story became more than a personal memory. It became a collective reminder that the inexplicable can manifest when we least expect it. And even those who doubted never forgot what they heard. And you, would you believe Edward, or would you say it was all just coincidence? Here at Are There Angels Among Us? Every testimony carries a unique impact. Comment below. I'd believe if you'd give credit to this story, or I'd doubt if you'd find it hard to trust. The days after the tragedy were like walking through an unfamiliar field. Nothing felt the same, not even the simplest things. The mere act of waking up in the morning carried a new weight, the privilege of breathing. Edward began to notice details he'd previously ignored: the smile of a child on the street, a lingering hug from a friend, even the song of birds outside his window. Every small moment became grand, as if part of a second chance he couldn't waste. His relationships with people also changed profoundly. Where routine once pushed him to rush, he now sought to slow down. Every conversation with Catherine, every call to a distant relative, every meeting with friends gained new value. It was as if he'd realized nothing is guaranteed and life can change in seconds. This awareness led him to nurture stronger bonds, mend broken ties, and above all, forgive grudges that no longer had a place in his heart. Faith, which had always been a quiet part of him, emerged as a beacon. Edward didn't speak of the voice to boast or impress. When he shared, it was with a calm, almost reverent tone. "I don't know who spoke to me, but I know I was spared," he said. That simplicity touched more than any elaborate explanation. After all, it wasn't the story of a hero, but of an ordinary person who, without understanding why, received a chance many didn't. Over the months, interview requests continued, but Edward declined most. He didn't want to turn the mystery into a spectacle. He preferred sharing in small circles, intimate conversations, moments of faith. It was in those quiet encounters that people were truly moved, not by the noise of the tragedy, but by the serenity with which he conveyed gratitude. Thus, his story didn't become a headline, but spread as a whisper of hope, silently inspiring those who needed to hear it. And yet, the mystery never left him. He never heard that voice again. There was no repeat, no new warnings. What happened inside the plane remained a singular, unforgettable mark. Sometimes, in the silence of the night, he'd lie down remembering the phrase that echoed within him: "Get out now." No scientific explanation could erase that memory, and though doubt persisted, one certainty solidified. Every day, every breath was a living reminder that that voice had saved him. Fate could have written the end of Edward's story on that plane, but something greater changed the script of his life forever. A mysterious voice, an unlikely decision, and a deliverance impossible to ignore. This experience didn't bring easy answers, but it brought one certainty: life is fragile, and every second is precious. New stories like this are coming, so click the video below and dive into another emotion that will touch your soul. Until then.